company that put out this game, and this game, and this game, and this game, and fucking even this game is amazing. And you know money isn't tight with how much of a cash.
How could anyone forget such a wonderful game, with its splendid story and unique and interesting characters? Let alone the wonderful world building and non-stop entertaining gameplay. I mean, this beauty right here changed a generation. It changed me. But I didn't forget. I'll never forget. You, bully.
Bully, or Canis Canem Edit in the PAL regions, for those who don't know, is a 2006 open-world action-adventure game developed by Rockstar Vancouver. You play as a young rebel teen by the name of Jimmy Hopkins. Hopkins is brought to Bullsworth Academy by his mother and stepfather, as Jimmy is a bit of a hoodlum. Jimmy displays how discontent he is with this pretty openly. Bully is more than just a game about being a troubled kid in high school, but demonstrates very beautiful character development as you follow Jimmy throughout his year in the school. You befriend a boy named Gary Smith almost immediately. He's a bit strange and unsettling. It's pretty clear something's not right with him. He also has a pretty bad reputation in the school from not just the students but other staff members. Gary very openly expresses his plans to take over the school in front of and around everyone. Gary makes Jimmy familiar with all the cliques in the school. This includes the nerds, jocks, prep kids, and the greasers. But Gary stops taking his medication and over time becomes more and more paranoid, where at the end of chapter 1 he thinks Jimmy is plotting something against him, so he puts Russell, one of the most feared jocks, up to the task of beating Jimmy to a pulp. But after that fails, he disappears and starts creating all sorts of troubles for you and Jimmy to deal with. This leads off into chapter 2. The chapter starts off with Gord complimenting you on winning the fight against Russell at the end of chapter 1, and he ends up inviting you to the boxing gym. He gets acquainted with the preps, goes on a date with Pinky, and wins a beach house by winning a boxing tournament. Some of the preps form a plan to egg Mr. Hattrick's house due to him nearly getting Mr. Galloway fired, and they ask Jimmy to provide the eggs. As the preps meet Jimmy in front of Tad's house, Gary shows up. He accuses Jimmy of having said various things about Tad's family, causing the preps to attack him. Now in bed sitting with the preps, Jimmy is constantly attacked by them. He displays his discontent with this by egging Tad's house. Jimmy later asks Pete for help. The preps just will not stop antagonizing him. Pete points out that the abuse that Jimmy has been doing to them is nothing worse than what they get from their own families, so he has to prove that he's better than their best man. He suggests that Jimmy challenge Biff to a boxing match. Jimmy does so and beats his ass, and as the rest of the preps stand around unsure of what to do, Derby, their leader, shows up. He reminds them that being a prep is about
breeding and nepotism and snobbery.
Jimmy chases him upstairs into the bar above the boxing gym, where Derby hides behind the bar and his friends during the fight. Derby, however, is forced to face Jimmy and gets turned into red mush. Jimmy then forces Derby to call him the boss. Chapter 3 begins with Jimmy and Pete in the boys' dorm room playing darts, when Peanut comes and tells Jimmy that the Greasers' leader Johnny needs help. Jimmy dismisses this. Petey tells Jimmy who Johnny really is, and getting friendly with him could be good, because he can help Jimmy get his hands on Gary. Jimmy then meets Johnny, who's furious because he suspects that his girlfriend Lola is cheating on him with Gord. He then proceeds to hire Jimmy to take pictures to prove it. Jimmy catches them in the act, and gives the pictures to Johnny, and is now more furious than he was before. Johnny then tells Jimmy to lure Gord into an abandoned indoor BMX park so he can kick his ass. Jimmy provokes Gord and a few other preps to follow him to the BMX park, where Johnny and some other greasers are waiting in ambush. A fight breaks out with Jimmy helping the greasers, and afterwards, he's in good standings with them. Later, Jimmy visits the preps, who are mad at him for helping the greasers beat up Gord. Derby brings up that now Jimmy runs their clique. He tells Jimmy how he shouldn't be helping their enemies and manipulates him into spray painting graffiti all over the place. Jimmy does this and is now on bad terms with the greasers. Jimmy then visits Ernest in the library, who tells him that Johnny is after Algie because he thinks Algie has made moves on Lola. Ernest tells Jimmy to find Cornelius, who might know where Algie is. Jimmy finds Cornelius being bullied by the greasers, who are trying to intimidate him into telling them where Algie is. Cornelius says that Algie's at a pizza parlor, then the greasers run off looking for him. Norton and Vance stay behind to beat up Cornelius, but Jimmy stops them. Cornelius then tells Jimmy that he lied and Algie's actually in the new Coventry. Jimmy finds Algie and they both see Lola flirting with Chad. Lola ends up dumping both Chad and Algie at the same time, just before the angry greasers greasers arrive. Jimmy, Chad, and Algie escape from the greasers by riding bikes. Algie takes Lola's bikes, while Chad and Jimmy ride on Chad's bike, with Jimmy shooting with his slingshot at the pursuing greasers. They safely return to the school, where Ernest and Cornelius thank Jimmy for helping them. Jimmy then claims the greasers hang out by beating them up, as he usually does. He then accidentally gets in the middle of an argument between Johnny and Lola. Johnny accuses Jimmy of trying to get Lola, and she makes matters worse by getting them to compete in a bike race over her. After Jimmy wins, Johnny blames his bike and then leaves to tune it up. Lola takes the opportunity to move in on Jimmy, which just makes Johnny even angrier. Jimmy meets up with Lola and she flirts with him. He tries to resist her, but she manages to persuade him into retrieving her stuff from the abandoned tenements, even though he ends up having to fight a sledgehammer-wielding Norton. He then meets up with Lola again, who then tells him that the greasers and preps are having a big brawl over her, and she insults him for not participating. Deciding that the only way to make an end of the fight is to stop Johnny, Jimmy decides to go after him. He tracks down Johnny's second-in-command, Peanut, and beats him up along with Vance and Lefty. As Jimmy is gloating over this, Johnny appears and decks him in the back of the head with a single punch. The cops come and Johnny rides off on a bike, with Jimmy following him right behind with another bike. Jimmy successfully outrides the cops and follows Johnny into a junkyard, where a greaser pulls a hidden chain across the road, causing Jimmy to fall off his bike. Johnny is riding a bike and wielding a pipe, and the greasers are up on piles of cars surrounding the junkyard, throwing various weapons at Jimmy. Pete, who happens to be there, yells to Jimmy to get rid of the greasers that are in the way so he can get to the crane. Jimmy does this, and Pete turns on the crane, taking away Johnny's bike and the pipe that he's using to attack Jimmy with. Jimmy fights Johnny and wins fairly. Johnny then tells Jimmy that he can have Lola since he won the fight, but is shocked when Jimmy says that he has no interest in her, and then says,
You can keep that slut for yourself.
Chapter 4 starts with Jimmy and Pete talking out front of the school. Jimmy hurts Petey's putty-ass feelings after calling him a dork. Petey quite literally runs into Ted and Damon, who proceed to bully him. Jimmy runs them off and then tells Petey that now he has his new targets. To take down the jocks, Jimmy tries to get the help of the nerds, but they have suddenly decided that they hate him. Petey tells Jimmy to go after Ernest, the nerd leader. Jimmy fights his way through the country area behind the school down to the abandoned observatory where the nerds hang out. Winning Ernest over, Jimmy allows him to plan the assault on the jocks. Ernest promptly gets Jimmy in trouble when he asks for risque pictures of the head cheerleader, Mandy, then blows them up into full-size pictures. Jimmy also has to fend off a jock assault on the observatory and save Bucky and Fatty when they tried to ambush the jocks at the funhouse at the carnival before it backfired. Later, Jimmy sees Mandy on the bleachers upset about the risque pictures of her. Feeling guilty, Jimmy covers them up, thus winning Mandy over. Ernest finally comes up with a plan to sabotage a big football game. Jimmy steals the mascot costume and infiltrates the jocks that way. He pees in the water cooler, puts super glue on the bench, and marbles all over the field, and rigs the footballs with explosives. Jimmy is now a terrorist. In the end, Jimmy unmasks and kicks the shit out of Ted, throwing the explosive rigged footballs at his defenders and eventually sacking him. Petey joins him on the football field, exclaiming that now Jimmy has beaten the jocks in front of the entire school. He now runs the place. Since Jimmy now rules the school, he decides to pull off a good prank, and is convinced to go graffiti the town hall. Jimmy does this, and when he comes back, all hell is broken loose. Shit is on fire, infested with rats. Everyone hates you now. You are then brought to Dr. Crabblesnitch's office, where Jimmy is expelled. It is revealed that Gary squealed on Jimmy for writing the graffiti on the town hall. Jimmy's encouraged by Petey to go investigate the townies more thoroughly. Jimmy heads to Blue Sky Industrial Park, where he meets Zoe, a girl who was expelled from Bullsworth Academy. Jimmy pursues the clique leaders, and after beating them up again, Jimmy goes heading over to Gary. He enters the school, where Edgar has beaten up the bullies Trent, Davis, and Ethan, the same three members that you beat up at the beginning of the game. But just after Edgar leaves, Jimmy's attacked by the prefects, who confiscate his slingshot, but Russell chases him off, leaving Jimmy alone. Gary finally reveals himself, and the two engage in a chase up the partially complete bell tower, with Gary taunting Jimmy all the way and bragging about how easily it was to manipulate everyone. But when Gary insults Jimmy's mother, Jimmy loses it and attacks him. They fight on the scaffolding, eventually falling through, both on the skylight over Crabblesnitch's office. Having overheard Gary's gloating and finally seeing the truth, Crabblesnitch proceeds to right most of the wrongdoings that have taken place, ending the main storyline. He reinstates Jimmy and Zoe at Bullsworth Academy, expels Gary, he fires Mr. Burton for being a pervert, and makes Pete the new head boy, and that sums up the whole mainline story of the game. Now, the story is really cool, in-depth, and very fun to go through, but I'd like to take a second to talk about the environment that this happens in. Each person that attends the school has a name, has a certain personality, their own specific voice lines, different insults depending on clothing. Each character is their own person. The world building is insane. Each character has a past and a present, whether it be what they fear, like, dislike. You can explore each of the students' personalities individually to a decent extent. It makes it feel like you're in a real place, as everyone has an actual personality behind their character. My absolute favorite is how each of the different girls play off going on a date with Jimmy when he is dressed in the most obnoxious clothing on earth. Bully has been one of my all-time favorite Rockstar games ever. Actually, one of my favorite games of all time. It contains some of the most unique, emotionally attaching character development than almost any game out there. I personally hold this up there with the likes of The Last of Us, GTA San Andreas, Detroit Become Human, and Metal Gear Solid 3, where when you start the game, who you play as becomes a drastically different person compared to who they are over time, but does it in a subtle enough manner where it can go almost unnoticed, until certain instances come up. Obviously this game has its gremlins, but I do honestly think that this is one of Rockstar's best games. If you haven't played it, I really think you should consider doing so. The game goes on sale constantly on Steam, and it's just generally good to have in your library. It's a really good time burner, it has really good story, you can tell that there's just a lot of genuine care behind the game. And that's why Bully was Rockstar's peak. And with that, I will see all of you in the next one. Bye.